Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's so lovely to be here.
Hello to
with you.
Australia. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Australia says hello back.
And we're gonna speak about living a facilitative life today.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, the perfect topic for the festive season and the end of the year. And before we're getting there, always start with the same kind of warm-up question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
I've really not sure. I think I had about in 2012, I had an illness, a medical illness, and it was a time of off work and unplugging from everything. And as I was coming back into the recovery phase, I was just doing a reflection on my life and my career and what I'd done and what were my strengths. And then all of a sudden what popped out at me was facilitation. And I thought, I really would like to shape that more and be more deliberate around my facilitation practice per se. And so I think it's only just recently that in my LinkedIn profile, I'm calling myself a change and culture facilitator, but it's not a title per se that I'm a facilitator. It's more, that's what I do, but it's not my title, so to speak. And so I think that even now I don't call myself, I'm not advertising myself as a facilitator. It's just part of my toolkit. And it's amongst many other things that I use. However, it's very much a part of my mindset that you're just facilitating conversations, you're facilitating people getting from A to B, you're facilitating, when I mean A to B, I mean, transitioning from one part of their life to another part of their life, or from being a supervisor to a manager, from a manager to a CEO. Those types of things require a certain amount of being facilitative. But yeah, I think I can't really recall when I started calling facilitator, but I think about 2012 when I recognized my skill set around facilitation. But even then, I didn't. I've never had a job title that's called myself a facilitator. It's just part of my toolkit.
Interesting. I hear that a lot. And I would be curious, you mentioned a few words that I would like to unpack. So the facilitation as a mindset as opposed to part of a toolkit, so something you do and something you apply to your thinking. And then the facilitative, what is the difference between facilitative and facilitating?
Yeah, what a great question. There's so many aspects of your life, and I'm not sure if there is too much of a difference, particularly when you're being facilitative in so many things in your life and it becomes a part of who you are and what you do. And, there's definitely times where I guess you try not to be facilitative deliberately. And I remember having, I lived with two other gentlemen, and we were sitting around having Friday night dinner, and I remember asking a question, and my friend said to me, he said, "You've just made it like a workshop, Stephen, with that question." And I went, And so, yeah, I think it can become, you're so into that mode and you can see the benefit of it, you forget when not to use it. And so I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but there's so many different components that you do it. And recently I've written this chapter in a book, The Power of Facilitation, and it's called Living a Facilitative Life. And we interviewed 40 non-facilitators.
Mm.
And because we had this hunch that people were being facilitative without even knowing that they're being facilitating. And it was, we just saw it was evident in so many people's way of being without labeling themselves facilitators or being facilitative.
Mm. So what I hear is exactly this nuance that being facilitative, it's basically, if I understand it correctly, you absorbed it so much that it becomes a second nature, something intuitive, unconscious, whereas facilitating is the conscious application of a craft, of something we're doing.
Yeah, but there's also that component of it that is it a part of us anyway, and it's just a bit dormant, and it's through practicing it more, it becomes alive. And I guess that's part of, I guess my argument is that we do have it as a part of us. And when we see somebody else doing it, and then we go, oh yeah, and it starts to emerge from us.
I would like to dig deeper into that and hear from you. How do we detect that, and how do we wake it up? And when is the moment that we maybe overdo it? Just as you explained, your friend saying over the dinner table, oh, stop facilitating. You're making a workshop out of it. And I've heard that a lot from my mom, from my friends, from Miriam, don't try to facilitate your date. My mom, I'm not your client. Don't do a workshop with me. Stop asking me these coaching questions. So
yeah, totally.
So how do we detect it in us? How do we find it? How do we wake it up? And how can we avoid overdoing it?
Well, the other question is, do we need to detect it? It's like with these 40 people that we interviewed, they were going on being facilitative with no label around facilitation, and they were, by all means of the word, being facilitative, but never considered themselves to be a facilitator or use the word facilitation.
Can you give an example?
One was a musician, and he was talking about having conversations with people. And he was talking about the importance of listening. And he said that, and not telling, and maybe asking a question here or there to help them understand what they had or see a different perspective. And he was facilitating a new outcome for that person. He was facilitating a new direction. He was facilitating a new way of thinking. You might call it coaching, you might call it a whole range of things. But in fact, he was doing that. And without having a label or needing to have a label that he was being facilitative or a facilitator. But I think, and then there's the other question is, I have found once I understood what facilitation was and the broader use of it, and I started to interact with more facilitators, I started to see a greater sense of its application. So it's a bit of it's, it can remain dormant and it's really good and that's enough, that's all I need. And then I found myself in the different professions I had. I was a quality manager of large teaching hospitals and facilitating root cause analysis of major clinical incidents or events, solving particular problems, and then in organizational development and business development, facilitating strategic planning and a whole range of things. So those skills as a result of my profession got broader and broader, and then I saw somebody doing that and I saw the application of it and I applied it myself. So there's that thing. Some people just by being naturally facilitative don't need a label, don't need another set of skills. But then somebody like ourselves, we see the value of it and we can see where we can apply it, and therefore we're very interested in knowing what they're doing in the art of hosting, what they're doing in complex systems, and yeah, and you just keep looking for different ways of applying it and getting better at your craft.
Mm. And so the musician that you interviewed and the 39 others, were they aware of it? Or was it something that when you pointed out saying, oh, you're very facilitative in your way of communicating or your way of interacting, were they surprised? How did you?
No, we didn't do it. We were just collecting data and having the interviews, and my friend, co-author of this chapter, Kavi, he was doing his interviews, I was doing my interviews, and then we brought the data. It was just a purpose. We just want to have a conversation with you about life and life in general. And we just had a hunch. So maybe a bias was working behind what we were doing. Yep. And maybe that was influencing the questions that we were asking and getting the results. But we weren't labeling what they were saying. We were just listening and then looking at the data and seeing. And that's where we started to draw out the core skills that we saw, the core ways of being, of what we called it, of somebody that was being facilitative in that moment. So that was our interest, was we wanted to know what are the ways of being of these people, and how do they relate to us in general. And what's been really interesting of this whole process of writing this book and writing the chapter, and then the post, podcasts and webinars and talking about the chapter itself, it's grown in terms of its life. It's just been like, you throw out those concepts, how does that relate to you? And then you get all of this feedback, and then you've got a new body of work that starts to emerge from it. So it's been like a very much a living experiment, and it's still going on.
So what became possible from that? And now, after having witnessed this, the impact, what does it mean now to you to live a facilitative life?
What does it mean? It just means showing up, and this whole thing without invitation, you're just being present and ready to whatever the moment provides. And I'm just more acutely alert. The principle I have is that when I'm facilitating is that the wisdom lies within the room. And so now that what that has come about is the wisdom lies with that person. The wisdom lies with this group of people, whatever it is, wherever it is. So what does it mean? It's helped me listen more. It's helped me tell less. It's helped me ask questions that help explore. And it's helped me believe more in possibilities and potential. I don't give up. I guess you might call that more resilient. I'm not sure if it is resilience, but it's more about there's a way, and I just keep. It just has made me more optimistic, more possibility thinking.
So basically, treating every situation as if it was a workshop, but then in a light way. And this relates to the previous question. How can we then avoid, and do we, that we treat every situation like a workshop and that we become these annoying facilitators?
Yeah, you just have to have lots of good friends around you who give you a slap when you're doing that. And I guess that's one way. You just have to be super alert and just learn to have fun in the moment. I have to really just say, no, this is not the moment. Just watch and observe and listen. Just being light, I think, is the key for me these days. And because you know, our whole life is really in a workshop, and being,
Literally.
yeah, you know, every situation arises. You think you're cruising, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, you think, oh, everything's hunky dory, and then just a small moment, you go, oh yeah, okay, more work required. But yeah, I think it's just a process of awareness and just learning when it's required, when it's not, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, and a little bit of, you know, mistakes here and there, not mistakes, but where you sort of put your foot in it and you think, okay, yeah, learning process, I guess.
Is it an intuition when it's appropriate or when it isn't? And I try to put my finger on the situation because somehow my gut tells me that we can tell when it's not appropriate, when we become these annoying coaches or facilitators. Oh, tell me more. How did it make you feel?
Just slap. Yeah. As my same housemate, he says, I'm going to give you a thick ear. So that's our way of saying stop it, Steve. That's his way of saying stop it, Stephen. But I think you know, the whole thing of intuition is that thing of where to be, what to say, what not to say. That's the key for me, and I think that as facilitators, the more I've spoken to people, the more the facilitators who have tuned in and amplified their intuition do actually cultivate silence, are okay with silence, do have some type of practice where they unplug and allow themselves to unplug so that they're amplifying that internal quiet so that they can pick up the moment of where to be, who to speak to, and I think it's a real experiment because I've really experimented in my work life because I worked in healthcare for 33 years, and I worked as, you know, large teaching hospitals, you know, really actively involved on a day-to-day basis. And when I was living in India, I was administrator of a trauma centre, and by its very name, we would get lots of road trauma and what we would call mass casualties, where you'd get lots of, you know, a bus would overturn or a Jeep would hit a parked truck and you'd get 13, 14 people, you know, coming en masse, 40 people, 50 people coming en masse from a bus accident. And that's when I really got to experiment with silence and intuition, because you had to have your shit together. And you know, you get a phone call in the middle of the night, you know this is happening, and you get there, and you know, you've got to clear all of the hospital wards, you've got to turn wards into operating theatres, and it's, you know, there's a heap going on. And that's where I really experimented and got to see, you know, that whole thing of intuition, which for me is knowing where to be at the right moment in the right place, and things flow. But I think once you say, I want to amplify my intuition more, then you're looking at what the building blocks of intuition is. And, you know, what are those moments when I ignore it? What are the outcomes of that? And you just keep doing experiments, and you've got that feedback loop, particularly if you have a reflective practice or something.
And if you give yourself the time to sit back and observe, be silent and just let it sink. I'm intrigued. And this one phrase of yours just stuck with me, the amplifying the silence side of you. It's just the power of this word or concept. And silence is then literal, or is the inner game and the state of mind, but it's also literally. So in such a situation as you described it, with 40 traumatized people coming in, if you don't have your shit together, your stress will spill over to the group and will create more stress. So you really need to find your inner calm. So I wonder, how are you now applying these learnings and this mindset to the group work you're doing back in Australia? So what have you learned from dealing with these crisis situations about just another workshop, and not falling into the trap to say, aren't you exaggerating that you have the impression that your life is difficult? Go to India and look at their life. So there is a trap that you could become sarcastic and not take the small struggles of life seriously after having lived the other extreme.
Yeah, wow. I think a few things that I do is around the preparation before the workshop, which ground me in their current realities and who they are and what they're going through, just that sense of empathy. So putting in enough time to being with the people, not everybody that's going to be in the workshop, but at least the core team, to get a real feel of them and as people and their current reality, so that you can be grounded in that. So that's one part of my practice. And the other part of the practice is the silence before the workshop. So when I'm co-facilitating with my colleague, even if it's online, is that time that we spend just holding the intent. We used to do it so much more easily when it was face-to-face, and now we're having to, because we would just do it, we just have that switch 15 minutes before, we would just sit down, we'd just both sit there and we weren't talking to each other. And then trying to plan all of that into the virtual workshop and doing that wasn't as easy. And we have to be more deliberate. We're in different parts of the world, and when we were face to face, it was just our own presence of each other. We just didn't speak to each other. So I think that preparation of prior to the workshop, but also during, and checking in with the people that who are the co-designers of the workshop, how things going, in terms of my language that I'm using. Is there anything that's not they're used to? There's just so many different things. And then the last thing is, at the end of the day, sitting back and having a really honest reflection around how the workshop went. So I think that they're all of my practices, is it's the design and the preparation and meeting with people, making sure I'm in touch with their realities and really listening to what's going on, and trying to reflect much as possible about that, the silence before. And look, I think if anybody's listening to that and saying this is woohoo type of stuff, please don't believe a word I say. Experiment with it. Experiment for yourself and see what is the difference of just sitting there and holding the intent, or just having that quiet time before people enter the room, or virtual room or physical room or whatever it is, and regular check-ins with the team as you're going through the workshop. And the last bit is that reflection. And I would say that the reflection is easily an hour to 90 minutes long every time, even if it's just been a 90-minute online workshop. Now, you might say that that's a real investment, but I just think it's crucial.
Otherwise, we don't learn, right? And I would be curious about your routine in this reflection. Do you have something like a questionnaire that you would go through? 3 questions?
Yeah, 3 questions. Same questions every time.
What are the questions, if I may ask?
Yeah, we start with what worked well. And what could have that's question number 1. What could have we done differently? And what's our action? What are we going to do next? what practice, how do we change that? And really those questions, particularly when it's co-facilitating, we're asking what each other did well, what we did as a group, and honestly feeding back to each other. Did you realize this? Because when I used to ask a lot of closed questions, and my colleague would keep reminding me, and he said, you asked 6 closed questions there. I said, no, I wasn't even aware. And he said, did you know? Well, this had just closed the conversation down. I said, okay. And so it was that just helped me aware of a particular style of mine, and his watching and helping me reflect on that helped me change that. Yeah, so we are brutally honest with each other with respect to what we noticed in each other.
Thank you so much for sharing that. This blind spot of ours that we are asking closed questions, even as coaches and facilitators. And I think it just highlights the importance of having this sparring partner or colleague or mirror, or however you want to call them. It happened to me recently in a podcast interview. I was asking a question, and then I realized I'm asking a totally closed question, giving the answer myself. What do I expect my interview partner to reply?
Yeah. I've to help myself, I came up with a list of all of the words that a closed question starts with. So I can share that with you and the listeners. And I did it on LinkedIn so that I could populate some more to that. And that was really helpful. And so I had that list, so I know, and just having the exercise of writing that made me more aware of, I was just about to ask a closed question, even mid question, and I'd go, and I'd change the words around.
Do you have maybe 1 or 2 examples at your fingertip? Was there, is a yes or no. Did you, was there, did you, I can't remember the rest. I'm sure I'll come up with a few more in a minute or two, but they're all that. It was really helpful to write that list. Once I'd written it and I wrote it with my own hands, it was useful. Just says he who can't remember them all. You don't have to anymore.
Yeah.
Now you have your list. And I guess that looking back at the list from time to time, it becomes a muscle you train. I have this list of words that I don't want to use. And sometimes I repeat them, and I get better and better at catching myself when I do use them. And in your retro after a workshop, have you ever come to the conclusion that a workshop failed?
No, because I think a workshop failure, the different perspectives, aren't there? So there'll be the participant's perspective and there'll be your perspective. But from my perspective, because I'm always looking at what worked well, what didn't work well, what can we do differently, that there's always something that worked well within that workshop. And even if the participants thought it was a failure, from my perspective, the fact that I realized it was a failure, I would have worked out what to do differently. So therefore, it's not a failure, because it's not a failure means futile to me. And it's not futile. And we're not perfect, and we are learning. And there will be times where we didn't do it so well and we could have done it better. But so what? Make a mistake here or there. I think that that's totally okay. When it comes from the participant's perspective, failure might be, that we didn't get the outcomes that we had desired, that there was, not all of the voices in the room were being heard. There was very little engagement and it was didactic. but to see a workshop as a complete failure, yeah, I'm not sure if I've ever seen that myself. There's definitely been ones where I would do better, and wasn't so happy. We had one online workshop which we just weren't totally happy with it. We didn't feel great about it at the end of it, but still there were parts of it that were good and we weren't going to change, that worked. So I think, yeah, I just think it's a loop. And I come from a quality background, and we use this model, which was called the Plan, Do, Check, Act, PDCA, and it's often called Plan, Do, Study, Act. Plan what you're going to do what you said you were going to do, check that you've done what you were going to do, and then act to hold the gain. So I think because of my background and training in quality, of, you're constantly improving and, action learning and all of those things, it's, for me, is, okay, there's always something to take away from it. And yeah.
Makes sense. And thank you for emphasizing both sides, the facilitator and the participant.
Yeah, they'll always have perspectives, and it's important to touch out, and we'll be, after a workshop, trying to touch into many of the voices as possible to find out how it went. So I think that that's important. It's not a one and done. There's so many opportunities for you to learn from it, and trying to get as many data points as you possibly can. People, if they really like it, they're going to tell you. If they don't like it, they might not be as willing to tell you. So, but you've got to find ways to get that data.
Yeah, which is then again about creating the space where you can be genuine with into each other, and where I like to play with the concept of safe space and calling it a brave space. So a space where we can actually take risks. And yesterday in a workshop, I think it was.
Did you call it a wave space?
Brave
space. Sorry, yeah, brave. Yep.
To take risks.
Yeah.
And yesterday I heard the beautiful quote: "If you cannot fail, you cannot learn." So much truth to that. If you're not taking any risk, then there's no opportunity to learn and to improve. But you really need to set the stage for that.
Yeah. I think also in my childhood, I don't think the language was used so much. Fail. Yeah, failure. It wasn't so much a sense of failure. I don't think it was always, go on, get up, have another go. Fall off the bike. Yep. Okay, got 6 stitches in my head. This happened. It wasn't a sense of, you idiot. What did you do? Okay, get back on the bike, fall off the horse. And I did. All of these things I'd done. Get back on the horse, nearly drown, get back in the water. And it was no sense of woe is me. That we weren't given that opportunity. My sister was a state level gymnast, falling off the beam and doing all of that type of thing. I think sports really helped us realize that you just pick yourself up and you go for it again.
Yeah. And it's so interesting how this mindset is nurtured from early childhood, as you mentioned. And it reminds me of something that I heard in a podcast interview. I think it was, anyway, about the difference between the upbringing of boys and girls, and an alternative explanation why girls tend to be more risk averse and less competitive. So when parents in Western societies, they would bring their boys to, let's say, Saturday soccer. And if their boy sucks, then I would say, you know what, now we're going to go on the field more often for you to practice so that next week you don't suck anymore. While when they bring the girl to soccer class and she sucks, they're like, oh, maybe tomorrow we're going to try swimming. Or let's try dancing to protect this girl from the feeling of not being good enough. Which then in the end actually teaches girls not, the fact that it's part of the game. And if we try more, we get better at it. It's not failure.
Yeah. And that didn't happen in our household. We all did the same things. Yeah. You know, we all had a go. It wasn't, I can't, in that definition, my sister's a girl, she won't do that. We just had a go at everything.
I'd like to come back to the silence that you mentioned. And because from what I heard, it sounded as if you're using silence as an instrument for your inner game. So to center yourself, to find peace, to connect to the purpose and to your participants, to your co-facilitator. And I'm curious whether you also use silence for the outer game. So in your workshops, in the work with your groups, and how?
Definitely do use silence, as in, it just depends. Again, it's about feeling the room and starting off with grounding exercises. I've noticed that it's more and more appropriate than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So it's definitely something that I'm doing more of, the grounding exercise, just honoring that, you know, people have come into that and, you know, they've all of the activities with getting their kids ready for school and everything that's going on in their world. And it might be towards the end of the financial year, it might be towards the end of the school academic year. And there's always something going on, and giving them permission and just saying, look, we recognize there's heaps of stuff going on, and we just do a grounding exercise, 2 to 3 minutes. So that's an important thing. And even within, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, giving space for personal reflection, where they don't have to, they're writing and they're speaking to each other, and, you know, you can facilitate that, put a little bit of music on. You can do that virtually and in the room. And so giving space for individual reflection. I think they're all important components. And then there's the other component is being okay with the silence.
As a facilitator, as a group?
Both. Yeah, you've got to be okay. You're not trying to rescue them from that silence. And just let it. And then all of a sudden, somebody's actually using that time to reflect. And then they'll say something and boom, it's like, oh, you know, I'm coaching some 14-year-olds, and one of them in particular, I can wait there 3-4 minutes. And and it was really uncomfortable for me. And then he'd just come up with something, and then I go, he needs that space and time, and he wants that space and time to think. And I had to learn to be, you could hear myself, shall I say something? He's not saying anything. And then I just had, no, this is his way. So I think you start with small experiments and you see what's liking, you feel the fidgetiness of people in the room, and you just test it out a little bit. Or you can speak to the people that are designing the workshop with, this is what I'm thinking, do you think it'd be appropriate for this group? And, you know, some say we'd love to experiment with that. But I'm finding more and more people are okay with it because they don't get given that space in the workplace.
Or they're not given that space full stop, or not giving themselves the space. I'm thinking of all the information overload and the shortened attention span of teenagers or young adults who grew up with smartphones. I sound like an old lady now, but I observed that even in myself. And then getting the gift of silence and pause is a gift. I realized that when I work with, especially with corporate groups, when I tell them in the beginning of a workshop, okay, let's take 2 minutes to just do a mental download, write down everything that's on your head that could distract you in the next X minutes or hours. Sometimes it's the best part of the workshop because they're just so grateful to have this time to just download and be and not rush and mentally prepare for what comes next.
I'm going to use that.
Magic.
Yeah, and I like what you said, that it's the gift of silence. And again, I think it's something to experiment with. If you're feeling, with the whole thought of it and you're listening to this and you're feeling uncomfortable with it, just experiment with it. And give yourself a few experiments where it's safe enough to experiment with silence.
It reminds me of the facilitative life. This is a fantastic opportunity to apply our facilitation skills or experiments to the life around us. So what happens if we apply more silence in our daily conversations and experiment when are we touching the edge where we become annoying facilitators or coaches? And when does it feel natural? Because maybe
but
also
I think people love to be listened to, and then that's an experiment, is how much am I talking too much and telling. And that's what I've had to be really conscious with myself, to try and pivot out of that and just listen more. And honestly, people just want to be listened to. And sometimes you don't have to say anything. And that was one of the things that the musician said. And he said, sometimes I'm just sitting there listening, and they're seeing that I'm listening, that I'm totally engaged. And then all of a sudden they come up with a solution. I haven't even asked a question. I haven't said anything. I've just sat there and listened to them. Is that facilitative? Yeah. Silence.
presence.
So I think presence. Yeah. So I think facilitation has so many dimensions. I think the key is not to get caught up in the labels, but just keep practicing and experimenting, have conversations like we're having now with groups of people around facilitation, what it is, what it isn't. The questions that you're asking me, it's a whole learning process. This isn't one way. There's a lot for me to walk away from in this conversation that I'm going to write about and reflect on. And I think that's what I love about communities of practice, is that the real opportunity to go into depth, whether it be, facilitation community of practice, or you might be into nonviolent communication and you've got a community of practice. It may be around complex system stuff or narrative therapy or whatever it is. That I think I love communities of practice because I get a lot out of them.
Yes. And especially, and that's the silver lining of the pandemic, that our communities of practice became global. Because suddenly we just connect online, and then we get all these different perspectives, which sometimes might feel uncomfortable, because before we're in our bubble, just agreeing with each other, our communities.
Yeah. Oh, I've seen lots of people come out of their shell who are friends of mine through these online communities and just develop a whole new life, because I guess it's given them a sense of that the things that we have in common are much stronger than the things that set us apart. and they needed that, and they needed to have that conversation. Yeah, I mean, we facilitated a conversation that was initiated in India because it was a really hard time in the midst of that pandemic, and we were still working through that with clients in India, and every time you came together, you had to give the first 15 minutes to see what was going on and who had lost somebody in their life, who one of their colleagues had passed away. There was just so much going on. So we provided an opportunity for people to just sort of unpack that and just listen to each other. And it was just really interesting to watch the energy at the beginning and the energy at the end. Through just being able to listen and hear diverse views and bits that they'd worked out for themselves and how that was useful to somebody else who hadn't worked that out. So yeah, it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is an easy way for us to share our gift of facilitation and to practice it more with our close friends. This week I was sitting in 2 workshops where it was about these magical moments in groups and going deep and being present with each other in questions. And I realized that it doesn't take that much, and it doesn't take much time. And I think just next time we're seeing a friend and ask them, how are you? And just pausing and holding the silence and seeing how long can they answer without stopping. And I'm sure that it's about our attitude and holding the space for them that would determine the time they take to answer.
Yeah, there's so many opportunities for feedback because it's the people that we live with will give us the most. And even this morning, I've got so much work to do. My roomie says to me, "Do you realize you finish off my sentences?" But I don't do it to everybody else. But it's sort of like, maybe I'm being so facilitative outside and I come home and I don't want to be facilitative anymore, and I just turn off that thing. So it's like, everything's a mirror. And I'm by no means a perfect facilitator and have got my game in order. So yeah, you have to take a few on the chin occasionally, and it's your householders that will give you the most honest, brutal, lovely feedback that will give you opportunities for growth.
Yeah, reality checks. Absolutely. And I think 2 observations. Very often I have the impression that facilitators and coaches are the worst listeners, feedback givers, conversation partners as soon as they put their hat off. So I've seen so many facilitators and coaches who jump directly into let me give you advice without asking a question mode.
Yeah.
Once they are not present as a facilitator or coach. And maybe it's because what you just said, we're doing this so much all day that if we're kind of free, we can let it down, then our inner nature comes back.
Yeah, well, it's what made me think of this like this was I was at it was, I guess, a day for educators, and there was about 100 educators in the room. They were all school educators, and one of the speakers was talking about the situation where her child should get in the car, and she's a teacher, and the kid would get into the car after school had finished, and she'd got all of these reports about the child and how well behaved and how cooperative with all of the kids she was, and that she was intelligent, and she was polite and all of this stuff. And as soon as she get into the car, this animal would just come out, and so one day she's driving along and the animal had come out, and she turned around, she said, "That's it, I'm fed." And she gives it, "Your teachers tell you like this and tell you you're wonderful and cooperative, but as soon as you get into this car, you turn into a monster. What's happening?" And the little girl just looked at it and just turned around and said, "Mum, I've used up all my good in the classroom." So that when she's used up all of that being good, and then she gets into the car and that's it, the facade is over. I don't have to hold that facade. And I think the same applies. You're putting so much energy into being there for that person and then when you get with your loved ones, it's just like, I've had enough. I just want to be a bastard.
Yeah.
Not consciously,
yeah.
but it's how to, yeah.
Yes. And before, I also wonder whether it has to do with our loved ones. And when you said your roommates told you that you're finishing their sentences, I wonder whether we're fighting most with our close ones, with the ones we love, because we assume that we know them. And there is this moment where you stop asking questions. So of course I finish your sentence because I know what you're going to say. Really. And it comes from a place of love and maybe just efficiency. I'm asking so many questions. I'm curious about everyone. I don't want to be curious about you anymore. Can I just rest? And now I wonder, how can we then nurture this facilitative life? How can we truly and generally live a facilitative life where asking questions and being good and being curious and listening and holding space is not a mask, but it is who we are, so that we can do it in the workshop room as much as around the breakfast table?
I don't know if I know the answer to that, because I think it's work in progress on that front. But if I'm getting less of it, and it just comes back to being aware of it, and having honest conversations about that. Yeah, and I think it's being okay with those moments when you haven't been facilitative and you've told, is just being gentle on yourself. And I think that the sign of that is how quick it takes you to recover from that moment. And I think that that's the key. It's not that I am not, it's how quickly I recover from it, and forgive myself and I'm gentle with myself. I think that they're really important qualities that I've found that I've had to nurture in myself, is that gentleness and that forgiveness, and said, yep, it's okay. You make mistakes, move on. And the more you can quickly get over it, the more they can quickly get over it. So that's just my experience.
Yeah, I love you anyway kind of approach to ourselves. I remember when I was a child, I always told my mom, I love you anyway. And I didn't understand the power of my words until one day she told me this is actually the biggest love declaration, because it means that, yeah, with all your flaws, I love you anyway, Mom.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, it's funny, even though that happened this morning, the sense of how we used that moment and the humor of it for the rest of the day was really quite funny. And so that humor disarms you.
Yes.
And you don't become so critical, or you've judged yourself. And that is a real art on behalf of my roomie.
And it is your inner game. Because what is humor to you in one situation might be a slap in your face that can cause a huge fight in a different situation. Because humor is also what we make out of it. So if someone tells me I'm childish or immature, or I'm finishing sentences, I might laugh about it because I know that actually it's not true, but in this situation, yes, it was. If I doubt whether it is true in all situations, I won't laugh about it, I'll cry.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yep. Good point. Really good point. Yep. I mean, what are the secrets in all of this? I don't know. I think it's that constant process of being reflective. There's moments when you're not reflective. That's okay. Having communities of practice, having good friend groups, having co-facilitators where you really honestly debrief. Yeah, having stretch things that really stretch you, bigger projects, more complex situations. That's an important part. All of those things are a part of getting better at all of this. And I think the number one thing that I've learned, I guess, particularly from my time in India, which I was there for 13 years, and we work 6 days a week there. Many of my colleagues were over 70. I had a friend who was a surgeon who was still operating 12 hours a day, and he was 80 plus. And my biggest realization is work is the way. And it's the way to my growth. It's the way to being a better person, because of all of those situations it provides me to stretch myself, to be, to use all of my resources, my inner resources. So I think that there was a period of time where I was wanting to do less work, and I'd gone down to 3 days a week so that I had more time to do all of these things. Then I went and lived in India, and it was 6 days a week, and it was 7 days a week, really. And then I had 1 day off a week, and it was Sunday, and I really learned how to value it. And I completely valued that day, and it just helped me be more grateful for what I had, enabled me to use my resources better, and enabled me to see there's so much more to me. I can do so much more than I give myself credit for. So yeah, I'm really grateful for that sort of cultural experience that I had when I was working in India.
Thank you for sharing that. It's beautiful reflection of our conversation, how it all fits in also to your personal experience. If someone in the audience would like to start living a more facilitative life, what would be your advice to them?
Experiment is the first thing, and there's opportunities to experiment in an incognito way without people thinking that you're running a workshop on their life, and just experimenting with different questions, experimenting with just listening more to when you want to tell, and trying to train yourself to listen more and tell less. Even give yourself that as an experience just for 1 week. So I'm going to be more conscious and aware of when I'm thinking I want to tell somebody, and then I'm just going to press the full stop and just check, is there anything else I can do in this situation rather than telling and giving advice? And that is really a door opener for facilitation. Tell less, ask more. Is the simple practice that you can do is just for 1 week, be conscious of where I'm wanting to tell. Wonderful. And it may be your children, it may be your partner, it may be your colleagues at work. There are so many opportunities that you can experiment with, except maybe your cat. Also, not my cat. He's the prince. He's the king of the house.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It was bliss talking to you and lots of food for further thought.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been absolutely a pleasure being with you and having this conversation. And as I said, lots for me to go away and write about and reflect on. So thank you very much.
It's the end of the podcast jingle.